Voila. I just want to thank Dean Hanrahan and the conference organizers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure being back at Pratt, and to the session chair, my brilliant student, but really now colleague, Meredith Tenhor, has been a real inspiration for me. So just quickly, if you had the mischance to read my abstract for the conference, I made some promises that I'd be speaking about Brooklyn native Woody Allen and this scene from Annie Hall, which had to do with our overestimation of the roles and capacity of the brain as such, what Allen in that scene calls the most overrated organ. And the promise or provocation was that I was going to look at more, let's say, gut feelings, as it were. And that might very well be what I accomplished this afternoon, but I'm not going to talk about Woody Allen as such, because Woody Allen accomplished something which I never have, and which is this.
I was thrown out of NYU my freshman year for cheating on my metaphysics final. You know, I looked within the soul of the boy sitting next to me.
I don't pretend to speak about other brains, as Dean Hanrahan called it. I often don't know what other people are thinking. I sometimes understand what they're saying, just as frequently don't understand what they mean. I find other people troublesome, and if you ever become friends with me, you'll understand the truth of that assertion. Or as that kind of soliloquizing Dane said, a little more than kin, but less than kind. So I just put this in. You'll see the context for this in a minute, but humans are riotous beings, and they're very difficult to grasp. So I'm going to start with a slightly lower order being, and suggest to you that all of today's talk, and I'll try to be brief about it, because I know it's the end of the day, is a bit of a pretext, if you will, for a certain passage that's to be found in the English naturalist Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man. And generally speaking, my objective today is to address the question of evolution, and by evolution I mean the unscrolling of a volute or a volume. One of the elements of the capital, we heard about the abacus earlier. We can also speak of the echinus. The echinus, like the gastropod mollusk, are the types of organisms I look at. Although I should say gastropods are very high-level organisms for me, in that they possess something that could be mistaken for, or seems like, intelligence or affection or memory or love of others. The organisms I like to write about are the parasites of polychaete worms, about which there's another form of commensalism going on. That said, just to kind of get this thing rolling, so here's our model organism, the gastropod. Again, Professor Malgrave began his talk very beautifully with the discussion of footprints, or vestiges, as an archaeologist would call them. And just want to put you in mind that gastropod, the term itself, comes from an organism with a kind of a more or less confused relation between its foot and its stomach, or the ventre, if you will, the ventral position of its stomach, which makes it a fun organism, as some would call it an anomalous organism. And I put this up, the term itself enters taxonomic nomenclature through Cuvier in 95. While he's still in Fécamp, he hasn't made it to Paris yet. But you see it's discussed in his heading of helminthology, which are parasitic worms, which is to say the fugitive nature of these organisms we're looking at, and perhaps the fugitive nature of what might be called kind of neural substance or neural performance. And we will be talking about other worms and snakes, things that are confused with helminths, in just one moment, helminths being kind of the parasitic variety. So here's that scene I showed you a moment ago. And so you can see this little clap of people. This is from Hogarth's Gin Lane, this very modern view of his contemporary London, where all is coming undone through excessive imbibation. And the reason I started this is because Meredith asked me in my presentation to address issues of pedagogy, which I will, and pedagogy specifically focused on the life of lines. And by this, I'm speaking particularly about narrative lines. And I also want to just pay tribute to Catherine Ingraham, who wrote an extraordinary book about this topic just a few years ago called The Burdens of Linearity. And hopefully I can put myself in dialogue with that very important work. But the type of knowing I am interested in is narrative knowing. And I've been often, through my work on accident, looking at narrative lines, their shapes, forms, disruptions, contours, what have you. And just to go on record, I'm changing course today. I'll show you some of the lines I have written about, thought about a lot, and now I'm thinking about a new line today, which is the slime trail, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So if you haven't picked him out yet, here's, do I have a pointer? Oh, whatever, I'll point the index. There's my snail. You can see there's this woman here who's quite dissipated, and Hogarth uses the snail as an emblem of time here, such as her state of unconsciousness, of mindlessness, that the snail makes its way from, in its slow progress, from the wall onto her shoulder without any sense that she will take notice of it. So the temporal dimension, but here's my little creature. And I just wanted to put this close up because one of the joys of Hogarth, one of the joys of engraving as such is the kind of making of a world with lines and this extraordinary variety of lines that have been laid in with the burin and other implements, and what kind of narratives, histories, reasonings, thoughts, ideas we can derive from these. So this is what I propose. I want to follow our little snail. No, do I have to? Can you hear me? Yeah. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember Phil Donahue, but that's kind of the, okay. I wanted to lay out some trail markers for you, so, because I know it's late in the day, so I'll be beginning with this snail. And it's kind of the evolution I want to talk about is the unmaking of that scroll, if you will, and you see the two little antennae-looking apparatuses on the front of our organism. Then we'll be encountering this one, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one, and then finally this one. So keep your eyes peeled, and when you get to 6, you can rejoice because you know you'll be drinking soon. Okay, so lines. This is a line that's the narrative line that's been a very central object of my obsession for some years now. You've probably all seen this frontispiece from William Hogarth's The Analysis of Beauty, 1753, and it's the so-called line of beauty, or the line of grace, which we can interpret, if only through the epigraphic text, as kind of the serpentine line, a line that turns and returns on itself. And its vitality in some way, or its potential mischance to which such sinuosities would lend themselves, are neatly encapsulated by Hogarth when he puts it in this kind of prismatic pyramid, as if to distill it and kind of displace it from the present currents of time. But you see the problems that ensue with some of the epigraph from Milton. So varied be, and of his torturous train, and I'm going to be talking about trains today, curled many a wanton wreath in the sight of Eve, the lure of the eye, Eve's lustful gaze in the garden. And we'll talking about, in a moment, an escape from a garden with snails. This is the famous play, kind of one of the central images for visual and design pedagogy for the 18th century, where you're seeing how the line of beauty and grace informs any number of these seemingly disparate monuments. You see the standing sculpture with the so-called figura serpentinata, that kind of S-shaped outline. Even the Loaquin, which is kind of a nice meditation by Hogarth on that kind of serpent-like creature within the artwork that transforms time and place. And finally, his formal description of the line of beauty, as you can see in 26, which is a line that's formed if one wraps it around the kind of the section of a cone. But the line itself, you see, has a certain taper to it, making it a tricky character. And in 49, we see this variety of lines, this whole palette one might choose from. And the educated artist would know, of course, that line blank is a line of beauty. Who knows? I haven't studied. Line 4, of course. What's with you? Philistines. Okay. The way this comes into narrative thinking for me, and I'm breaking no new ground here, is through the interpretation that the novelist Lawrence Stern makes of this in his very kind of riotous, if you will, proto-postmodern novel in many volumes, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman. And here you're seeing Uncle Toby discoursing upon the grievous injury that was done to his groin at the Battle of Namur by a projectile, such that we have to study another line, which is the parabola. But within the text itself, we not only see certain intimations of what it means to think or feel, if you will, or feel through literature, most famously here with the dark, dark page, the kind of abyss of print, which accompanies the meditation on mourning here, the reference to, of course, Shakespeare, Last Poor Yorick, a man of infinite jest, thus David Foster Wallace, et cetera, but some kind of literary technologies for getting into pathos of loss, of mourning, of melancholia. But more directly, in terms of the linearity, what Stern is doing in his joyful, perverse way is taking the line of beauty, that kind of serpentine path that kind of returns upon itself in a graceful way, and transforms it into a forlorn model of narrative progress. And when I say I know the world through narrative, you keep in mind, and here I'm leaning on the work of J. Hillis Miller, that the word narrative itself is derived from the root terms for knowing, all those kind of gnosos words, the nomen, the ruler, the regula, what have you. These are all allied terms with narrative. And what you're seeing here is an analysis conducted by Stern, his character, Tristram, within the context of the novel itself, which has some kind of literary self-consciousness then, of the story as it's being told, which is anything but that kind of sinuous line of beauty. And here's Tristram kind of berating himself, saying, well, I started this way and had that divagation and went back, and all was, all was astray. As Pliny would say, all was digressions. And he said, if only I could draw a tolerably straight line. And he used to say, but the only way to draw that line, as he says, is with the architect's rule, that ruler or regula or norma, which you'd have to borrow for the task. But a straight line is an unvaried line. It's a dead line. It's a line without life or vitality or interest or those involuted loops which draw us in, but are very kind of similar to how we approach and go through life. And there's other kind of flourishes of this sort, but I just want to speak to in a way quickly, the extent to which we should place our reliance in lines as forms of knowledge, even narrative knowledge. What you're seeing here is a transcription in the text of the flourish made by his Corporal Trim with his this kind of a libidinal flourish of his the bachelor's walking stick, which is then registered. But as it's taken up and transcribed in other texts, most famously in Balzac's The Peau de Chagrin, The Ass's Skin, we can see a transcription where the line becomes something else. It's lopsided, its kind of involutions become changed, and as the editions go along, what was a line and what was untrammeled and ungoverned, and perhaps ungovernable, like desire, as Trim was experiencing it, becomes rather regular, and here has a discernible beginning and end. It has a mouth. It becomes a snake, and the ambiguity of the figure somehow is lost. It's subsumed into some form of determinacy. Those are the lines I have dealt with typically in the past, but as I said, today I want to take on a new line, a line that has to do with my little mollusks. And here we can look at another way of ideation, another way of reckoning with desire. Where Philip mentioned Emilian Galatea earlier. Here's another kind of spin on that story. Here, Pratt is the origin of painting. Here, David Allen's version, one of the many hundreds of them. I chose this particular one because of the succinctness of the story, but also because the inamorata of the Corinthian maid is wearing a crimson toga. So you see, her modest brush first gave him taste, and chance to vermilion gave first place. It is as snails trace o'er the morning dew, he thus the lines of beauty drew. So the orange is a delineation, what Vitruvius was called skiography, the kind of the tracing of shadows, that which is fleeting. But this particular reckoning that Turner does here between the path of the snail and the outline of the soon-to-be missing being or body. But he mistakes somehow the way, in fact, snails make their paths, and that's what I want to get to in a minute. Vermilion itself as a colorant, as a dye, is very interesting. It comes from a particular type of insect. Here you can see the Kermes vermilis, which the word vermilis obviously comes from worms, so it goes back to this worm and snake-like organisms, and was a coveted dye in ancient times, dye stuff, but here's scroll number 2, if you will. I also want to get us back on track with our mollusks and remind you that the royal purple of antiquity is also the product of a mollusk here, the Murex trunculus, the Murex hemistoma. And here the story of how Heracles' dog, whilst biting into this mollusk, has its mucus on its mouth, which then turns red and purple when the light hits it. This is kind of the first kind of photographic, photogenerative medium. And here are some experiments that were done in the 19th century on this mucus from the Murex snail, which kind of bears out that royal purple. These were done by a naturalist by the name of Henri de la Casse-Dutière, who I'll come to at the end of our story as we trot along. Okay. Where is I going with this? Well, Turner. What I think is interesting about Turner is not only does he identify the snail, let's say a molluscan kind, as a type for contemplation, but he then has it figure in his own painting in a peculiar and arresting way, in what is, even for Turner, a truly kind of bizarre painting, which is War, the Exile, and the Rock Limpet. Here you see, of course, Napoleon with his tender in the state of exile, the surrounding crimson shore, kind of the evocation of the fields of war irrigated with blood, and Napoleon contemplating his own exile state. And he says, thy tent-formed shell, the limpet, kind of a flattened mollusk, a soldier's nightly bivouac alone amidst a sea of blood, but you can join your comrades, which is to say there was no going back for Napoleon, but this kind of interlocution between mollusk and man I thought was an interesting one. And Ruskin picks up on this very directly. Ruskin, obviously Turner's great champion and the administrator of his artistic estate. The conceit of Napoleon seeing a resemblance in the limpet shell to a tent was thought trivial by many, by most people at the time. It may be so, though not to my mind. And this is kind of the first kind of streak of consciousness I want to talk about, mindfulness, act of neuronal evidence, which is to say the work of interpretation that is taking place in the intermediation between the reflected visage of Napoleon and this limpet. The second thought, that even this poor wave-washed disc had power and liberty denied to him, Napoleon, will hardly, I think, be mocked at, which is to say there's some sense, if not of will, but kind of a life that's being animated and thought through by this limpet. If you're not convinced by that, then go and read your Lacan, which I really am not in the habit of doing. But you will recall that kind of moment in the Four Fundamental Principles where Lacan speaks here in Brittany, speaks about seeing this floating sardine can, and this interesting moment of when things in the world see us and constitute us as objects or fail to do so. You see that? Do you see that? Well, it doesn't see you, so, okay. I don't do psychoanalysis. I probably need it, but I don't do it. Okay. So here I want to introduce this other line, this line we had Turner set up for us, this snail trail. And I want to do it, interestingly, through another artist you probably know from this period, and some very curious comments he makes in his notebooks. This being Eugène Delacroix, these notebooks from Champoset from the forest of Sénart in the southeast of Paris. He says, Delacroix derived a visual lesson from kind of the grace of certain sinuosities, kind of those kind of S-shaped lines of grace, lines of beauty. Those of paths for example. And the paths he's speaking about are sillons. They're kind of little furrows that are made in the kind of ground by dripping water, made along the sea, by the receding tide, what have you. But it's a trail, something that's left behind and needs to be interpreted as something, as opposed to a trail that is pursued in the sense of wayfinding we're talking about. And he says it's a gracious thing. And he says it would be curious to observe and study the kind of trail, the trace, the index left by these snails, these limaçons, a term we'll come to in a moment. So you're seeing here, I'm sure all of you have seen this, if you have some garden, is the snail leaving its slime trail, which kind of effectuates its progress and mediates its contact with the ground below it. And there's another meaning to this which I think is important and germane to architecture. And this kind of complex of ideas is what makes the snail so very attractive to me. You're probably all familiar with the pericope and a snail which melteth, let every one of them pass away, which is kind of this Ecclesiastian notion. But it's based in kind of the etymology and physiology of the snail itself, which is the common conception of the time that as the snail left the trail, it exhausted itself. It kind of evacuated its own kind of corporeal being in the process of inscribing its path and making its kind of life interpretable, which is a very touching notion and also embodies within its name through the ancient Hebrew of its very home, its bait, its shell, if you will. Finally, with Eugene Delacroix, and this is for architects as well, Delacroix's kind of great annoyance at the regularity of things, particularly as rendered by architects. He says there are lines that are monsters, the straight, the regular serpentine, especially two parallels. These are all the kind of lines that, say, Tristan would have drawn had he had possession of an architect's rule. And he does this in particular in reference to his friend Louis Boulanger's The Round of Sabbath, where he says that all of the serpents and snakes in this kind of, what I must say is a truly hideous composition, are all kind of regular and repeating and don't have the life, the inner turmoil of things as they exist in nature, those kind of moments of resistance, affordance, what have you, which animates things. And is very kind of evident in his criticisms of architecture in particular, where he's looking at the work, say, of Percier and Fontaine and looking at their own models, or the work that takes place in the Académie. And here with our second nod to kind of mindfulness, he says it was interesting to verify whether regular lines don't exist merely in the brain of men, which is to say regularity as such, or that desire for things lining up, is not something that one will encounter in nature, perhaps not something one would want to, but rather is a mental conception, is a externalized expectation of human order. Okay, so last part. As I zip along. Here's the section, and I'll read it with you, and probably will need some help. But this is a section from the Descent of Man. And you see, again, part of the reason I wanted to look at gastropods is because through some kind of qualified sense, they're brainless organisms, which make them quite lovely and dear. They're capable of locomotion, and furnished with imperfect eyes. They have eye spots, they're not eyes as such. Do not appear to be endowed with sufficient mental powers for the members of the same sex to struggle together in rivalry and thus to acquire secondary sexual characteristics. So they're not, like Professor Malgrave, nest-building birds. They're not involved in the process of sexual selection. But with locomotion comes some apparatus for perception, looking forward, although what's interesting to me, or perhaps to us, by the end is the trail they leave behind, but not fully possessed of cognition as such in any recognizable form. But here appears the kind of the trouble, if you will, the little ripple. Darwin, as you probably all know, was a voluminous, maintained an enormous voluminous correspondence. Presumably received through the mail this account by Joseph Lonsdale, who was primarily acting as a geologist at this time and was secretary of the Geological Society in London. And he gets this story. He informs me that he placed a pair of hard shells, helix homotio. Helix is that spiral. One of which was weakly, into a small and ill-provided garden. So a couple of things that are interesting about this. First is that in the most rudimentary kind of thing you'd want to say about this is secondhand information. We all know Darwin to be a great observer, right? Think of his years on the Beagle and his investigations in his own garden down. There's no process of verification here. It's a story. It's a narrative. And interestingly, it's a narrative that has a nice, rich implication spatially and culturally, which is that there's a garden. Gardens have walls. Kind of this is, even though Kent left the fence somehow and made all of England a garden, here we still have walls, and these snails, as we'll see, left the fence in pursuit of better provided gardens. He says, after a short time, the strong and healthy individual disappeared and was traced by its track of slime over a wall into an adjoining, well-stocked garden. So the form of interpretability here, the way we can tell this story is through this slime trail. There might be some anticipation of pathfinding, wayfinding, goal-directedness, telos, whatever you want to call it, but it's that kind of exudation, the snails left behind, that is the kind of substance and stuff of this narrative. It is quite literally a linear narrative. Mr. Lonsdale concluded that it had deserted its sickly mate, here's the healthy snail, but after an absence of 24 hours it returned, which is to say, it knew its way back. Memory, I don't know, how do you do that? We've heard about how humans do it today. And apparently communicated the result of its successful exploration, for both of them started along the same track and disappeared over the wall. So he, what's that, when you do those restaurant-y things, what's that called? Yelped. He yelped. He says, hey, the other garden is very good. So, but the terms that are seeping in here are pregnant, and I must say, right for interpretation. They require interpretation.
The international audience can hear you.
Oh, even better. Should I speak in French or German or something? Okay, so over the wall we go. Okay. Here's my next scroll for you. You see we're getting towards the end. George Romanes, who is a very young kind of admirer of Darwin, and took up this story in a direct way in his book Animal Intelligence, which had an enormous afterlife, and I think is still with us in some part. And what Romanes does is subject this to some form of analysis, some verifiability, some process of interpretation, narrative analysis, which is what he's doing. Darwin was favored with this communication from Lonsdale. Romanes is going to test it. In part, test the organisms, in part, test the story. So I'll read this with you quickly because I know I'm running low on time. In this case, the fact must be accepted, seeing that it stands in the authority of an accurate observer, although we know that Darwin didn't observe it itself, and is so definite a kind as not to admit of mistake. Consequently, we are shut up to the alternative of supposing the return of the healthy snail to its mate a mere accident, and this is the accidental kind of thing Meredith was talking about. Somehow he went over the fence, over the wall, and kind of made his way back because he didn't know where he was doing or where he was going, what have you. This would be what Horace Walpole called kind of a happy accident, what he called serendipity. Where are we? Someone help me. I'm lost in space. A mere accident, and they're both going over the wall into the well-stocked garden, another mere accident, or acquiescing the interpretation with Mr. Darwin, the science, which would say this is a play of force. You're acquiescing to the interpretation. That's the battle. That's the struggle that's going to place here. Now, if we look closely into the matter, the chances against the double accident in question are certainly so considerable as to render the former supposition almost impossible. So what Romanes is doing here is not engaging in biology, he's engaging in what in the 18th century they would call probability, or the science of weighing or evaluating evidence. Probability comes from probare, the Latin word for to test, to weigh, to evaluate all these separate streams and strands of information, all these various stories that could be told or thought or remembered. On the other hand, there is evidence to prove, as I shall immediately show, that a not distantly allied animal is unquestionably able to remember a particular locality as its home. So now we have not only memory, but homing or home finding and kind of home likeness, which was an enormous theme in the end of the 19th century. With Linus Klein's very famous essay on kind of planomania, or the kind of desire to be like the planetes, to roam, to leave home. And he says, it's home and habitually to return to its locality after feeding. Therefore, in view of the analogous and corroborative case, the improbability of the snail remembering for 24 hours the position of its mate is very much reduced. While the subsequent communication, if it took place, communication now is the snails talking to each other, not Lonsdale talking to Darwin, although it's, I think, implied, would only require to have been of the nature of follow me, which, as we see repeatedly find, is a degree of communication ability which invertebrate animals possess. Okay, animals thinking, talking, communicating, feeling, knowing, sharing, directing each other. And also a degree of altruism, finally, because the healthy snail comes back for the weak-winged snail. Therefore, in view of these considerations, I incline to Mr. Darwin's opinion that the facts can only be explained by supposing them due to the intelligence on the part of the snails. The snails are now fully thinking, acting beings. Thus considered, these facts are no doubt very remarkable, and it goes without saying that if you are a thinking, acting, feeling being, this is how you feel and act and do. Precisely, you hop the wall with your sickly mate. For they would appear to indicate not merely accurate memory of the direction, these we'll be talking about all afternoon, if I'm not mistaken, for 24 hours, but also no small degree of something akin to permanent attachment. They love each other. It's like the love of plants that Erasmus Darwin wrote about. A sympathetic desire that another should share in good things which one has found. This fortuitous discovery. So let me wrap this up in the last few minutes. Here's my second to last scroll, I think. So this is the most gorgeously rendered turd in architectural history. This is from, obviously, Blondel's Corps d'Architecture. This is from one of the early architectural delineations of what's called a toilet, or lieu de soupape, a valve that was activated to remove these exudations, to kind of differentiate places within the maison particulière and kind of the foul and the fragrant, and all with the evolution of courtoisie. But the reason I put this in was was to highlight this text, when kind of to get kind of the post-Darwinian take on this problem, which is to say, if not exudations, here we can talk about excretions, which is to say those who followed Darwin and Romanes and tried to understand what precisely was happening when that snail left, and without ever really fully taking hold of what was to learn from, what was to be learned from the slime trail, which was a type of intelligence that comes much later. And since he was mentioned earlier today, you think of E.O. Wilson's work with the trails left by ants, this kind of sensibility we all know and are fed on, et cetera, et cetera. But here, the physiology and biology of plant excretions, a founding text of secondary metabolites in plants. Philip talked about metabolisms and such. Secondary metabolites are chemical agents that are synthesized by the plant body, which are not direct byproduct of its own respiration and photosynthesis. It aids in their life, if you will. And in this series of very interesting essays, which were conducted both in the field and also in the lab, where he simulated the field conditions of the snails, what Stahl tried to do is to show why snails eat certain plants and leave others alone, and whether, in fact, the plants possess some kind of directedness or intelligence or some kind of evolutionary tendency which would allow them to develop these secondary metabolic substances or agents which would prevent the snails from eating them, okay? Which would kind of then give a very nice Darwinian spin to this anecdote originally told by Darwin. But some kind of basilic-eyed critics, such as Patrick Geddes, the Scottish zoologist, later became a sociologist and city planner, in interpreting Stahl shows some of the kind of the pitfalls of this reasoning, this work of interpretation, these questions of mutuality when it's presumed that some form of thinking is taking place. But while snails, always accepting the specialists are snails that only eat certain plants as opposed to omnivores which eat all, are not fastidious in their diet. They draw the line somewhere. And I like this. Now we're drawing the line. It's not the slime trail, but it's what they'll eat, what they won't eat. Certain plants they have found to not agree with them, and these they eschew. And by the way, if the plant was kind of developing noxious aromatic oils or even crystal splinters in it, and they were being left alone by the snails, those plants would kind of succeed evolutionarily and would propagate themselves over the generations. They try them, suffer for it, remember the experience. Again, snails are now they're thinking, remembering, loving beings, and leave the disagreeable plants alone for the future. Which is to say, here Patrick Geddes, future sociologist and planner, is suggesting that snails, in fact, have a plan in mind when they go out foraging and jump the fence. I know I'm out of time. I'm at the end. So last couple of slides. So my couple of last scrolls. This goes back to the Hogarth image. You probably remember. And what you're seeing is the scroll from this kind of ridiculous kind of pediment over the entry to the pawn shop. You see S. Gripe pawn shop because in Gin Alley everyone's kind of making away with whatever they have that possesses worth. And the reason I thought this was particularly interesting is you see that the person at the pawn shop at the door is a carpenter or a tecton, or our original architect, who's selling his saw in order that he can buy more gin and dissipate himself. And the reason I show this is because I was expecting more of this today, which is, this is another snail, colimaçon, as Pascal called it, and here as it appeared in Durer's treatise. You see the schnecke, or the snail, which were these forms of kind of geometric description, which I thought, from all the discussion of kind of folding and whatever these architects are doing now, was going to be the order of the day. But my fear, in a more general sense, is that we're pawning one thing in order to acquire another, and I'm not sure we know what to do with it or what it's worth. But that's just one guy's opinion. Okay, last couple of slides. This is the fellow I mentioned earlier, Henri de la Caze-Dutière, who made those beautiful images, the purpuric material from those Murex trunculus, that kind of ancient purple dye. And this is one of his, not his earliest work, his earliest famous work were on corals, but the earliest work in his own journal. And you see it's from the autocyst, the kind of auditive capsules from mollusks. These are kind of these little bodies within the mollusk nervous system which allow them kind of to orient themselves. And the reason I show this is because there's one kind of final corrective, and again, is that the kind of the discussion of vision today and the insistence on the visual apparatus, of course the tactile, but the visual apparatus, and perhaps even with a little tribute to Lacan, but what's interesting about Le Caze-Dutière's investigation of the neuroanatomy of mollusks is he was the first to describe the relationship between the autocysts, which you see in that kind of dark body there, to the esophageal, or kind of the nervous system of the trunk, as opposed to the pedal nervous system, which is to say these instruments, these organs of perception, were not leading directly to the apparatus of locomotion, but to other neuroanatomical processes, which might then contribute to the life of the snail, which might suggest some forms of what? Kind of ideation or what have you. And this is kind of pursued very directly by Émile Young, the kind of Genevan naturalist who is often in France in his kind of physiological studies of the escargot, the Helix pomatia again. And he says there is a great attraction to research into the degree of awareness of external world possessed by inferior animals. If we admit that sensation, memory, association of ideas, will, etc., all the factors we're talking about today, are functions of the ganglionic nervous substance, then it follows that the physiologist's mission is to study them just as much as muscular excitation, for example. Moreover, observations in recent years show that the first signs of association of ideas by means of memory extends all the way down to the gastropod mollusks, and the escargot, the Helix pomatia, seems well suited to furnish new information in this domain. So let me finish with one more slide. And you know that joke, the guy goes to the Cadillac dealership and he says, I want a car and I want you to paint a big red S on the door, and he says, why? So he says, whenever he drives through town, everyone will say there, see the escargot. So, okay, so, but look, so it's that trail, that slime trail, which I'm pursuing and trying to kind of find some other types of, let's say, interpretive principles or possibilities. But finally, the spiral, which somehow dropped out, is this one, which is number 5, which is the cochlea, the colimaçon, the kind of the snail we all have in our ear, the cochlea, shell, which adjoins the vestibular apparatus, and finally the semicircular arches. And the reason I end with this slide, again, it's vision, is that to my knowledge, most of our spatial orientation and knowledge comes not from the eye, but from the ear. So, which is to say, through the axial orientation given by the semicircular arches, which I understand are compromised with age because the fluids in them become more viscous and it becomes more difficult for us to orient ourselves. But I just wanted to put that in juxtaposition, speaking as a non-specialist, but the kind of the cochlea, that little snail, that limaçon in our ear that kind of serves as the vestibule of our perception and understanding of space. So thank you for your kind attention. Procedural. Sorry. Could we not have this?
The lights are shining awfully bright in our eyes. Is there any way we can just have ambient light? We're going to be blinded and relying only on hearing.
Echolocation.
And our other senses for this panel discussion. Well, thank you so much, Deborah and Ed, for those fantastic presentations. I'm really pleased by the way in which both of them framed a bunch of questions that have been floating around our discussion today. And I thought maybe one potential point of connection between the two was the idea of the trace left by the snail. Both of you were talking about the practice of line making and drawing and the questions of whether, and this has been kind of a question that's persisted through the conference, whether we should be talking about plasticity as a justification for switching to digital tools because our minds are now, the young generation's minds are now so plastic that they occupy a different realm of representation, or whether we need to or maybe it's not an either-or question, I actually don't think it is, but whether we need to engage questions of representation in a different way, perhaps one that telescopes between past and present. And it seems like to me that the snail's trail, which is a kind of trace, a kind of mode of writing, which is you know, what Derrida thought Freud was talking about in his project for scientific psychology, where Freud talked for the first time about how you could think about the neuron as a kind of determiner of biology, and he eventually abandoned that. But that idea of a trace or a device that creates a kind of inscription is also, you know, makes me think of the kinds of trails and traces we live in and leave today, which gets to some of the questions that you raised yesterday, Michael, in your talk about biopolitics as well. I mean, we are all, and then I thought of with Eduardo's sensing helmets, you know, the way that we're all sort of now able to take and create data out of the various traces that we leave, and that leaves us open to new systems of control and modulation. So I wondered if you guys might be willing to address the trace in your work a little bit more and to take some positions in relationship to each other around that. Yeah, I don't know, Michael, if you're willing to start. Sorry, I know it's the end of the day.
Well, I'm not sure I have much to wake folks up, but I thought that the trace was very interesting. I also was making that connection to Derrida and Freud and the idea of that palimpsest, the materiality of the trace. I think that one of the things that is worth paying attention to in terms of the trace is what I was trying to talk about in terms of the unconscious, and particularly the political unconscious. There's a temptation to talk about the new, like we've entered into the new and so on, and that's a kind of will to forgetfulness. It's a form of repression, in other words. And what counts as the new is actually not new at all. I mean, this is an old modernist problem, right? So I think, you know, again, I'm interested in terms of drawing caution to how quickly we might embrace. It's a desire, and how quickly we might want to satisfy that desire because this is an experience of lack. Something that Philip brought up with Winnicott. I've also been working with Winnicott. I mean, not that he's dead, so not, but with his texts. No. That tired, right? Okay. And the thing about, thank you. The thing about Winnicott that I found quite interesting, is that his theorization of transitional objects has a pathological side to it. In other words, we hold on to transitional objects precisely because we don't realize that they're transitional. So the teddy bear that we can't let go of, we don't realize that it's something that we're supposed to use in order to deal with the separation from the mother. This is also something that's been repressed. The feminine in this discourse, the question of race, privilege, these are things that have been repressed in what we've been talking about, as if one can attend to biological processes or physiological processes independent of history and so on. So what I was trying to say about Jameson, I invoked Jameson yesterday, is precisely, even in the repression, there is some kind of index to history. You just can't lift yourself out of your bootstraps. You can't will yourself out of funding or forget that and so on, or all the capital that has to have been in place in order for this conference to take place, right? And for certain people to be here and others to not be able to be here. Who can actually take part in such a discourse? So those are my interests in trace, and I really like that idea of, I mean, I see human beings as, I think, similar way that Edward does. We leave a lot of slime traces, and we don't care that other people have to deal with that. That's
Right, those are actually two very important sides of this. The one side is that every slime trace needs to be captured and recorded in order to enter into a discourse of optimization, which is also a discourse of normalization, again, assuming that there's like a singular unified population and that by gathering, you know, abstract responses to space, we're creating something biological and not located in class, culture, and race. Also, your comments make me think a little bit of the way that environmental psychology has entered into racialized discourse in this country. I mean, it's worth mentioning that the environmental psychology that was based on the sort of scientific side of psychological observation, cataloging, and classifying reactions to space was used to justify architectural theorist Oscar Newman's ideas of defensible space, right? His idea was that if you created a certain kind of public space that would be desirable and comfortable to people of the middle classes who were not crime perpetuators, that, and you built that kind of public space all over, that people who committed crimes would simply disappear from cities. And Newman's theories of defensible space directly influenced the broken windows policing discourse that we see being applied so widely in New York. So it's a bit of a tangent, but that's a way of pointing to the fact that there is an ethics, to get back to Catherine's question earlier, to thinking about how our scientific research is deployed, and I think we need to attend to it.
I mean, just really quickly, I don't think it's so much of a tangent what you bring up. It's, I mean, the thing about biopolitics that I think gets left out, the discourse of biopolitics, is it's not just that it's a control of population. It's the creation of the notion of population in order for there to be control to be exerted. So it's a discursive formation. There's really quite a bit of continuity between early Foucault and his later turn to these areas.
Yeah. Well, there's control, and then there's also aesthetics, which played such an important role in your three talks too. The idea of the trace as a kind of form of aesthetics, and as aesthetics as a discourse and discipline, which would pull us into the cultural from the neurobiological, or tie those two realms together, or tie the perceptual to the neurological. I don't know if you want to, that's a pretty general question, but if you'd like to comment.
You know, for me it's a bit difficult. I love the idea of the trace and the lexical trace, but I don't think about it too much. I mean, not in my work. The trail, the crumbs, the fragments you leave behind in this kind of interconnected world of internet, that's something that's interesting to me. And I think, again, I'm thinking about young people. I mean, you know, you said, you know, chair of architecture running an education program. I think I have a lot of people we work together to build the pedagogy and the curriculum and all of this, but for me, I keep trying to see how the students are changing. And by changing, I don't mean radically. They're not radically other, but they are capable in a different way, and they have less ego, less authorship, less, at least many of them, and some of the best, actually, the very best. They find kind of these natural balances together. So it's for me, it's interesting, not the snail, the trace of the snail, but whether or not the snail could trace its own trace. That would be an interesting question for me, right? If you had 10 of them running around, could any of them backtrack? Would they recognize it? Is there anything that one could follow? And I think what we're talking about these days, or what I'm trying to get at with the discussion I'm engaged in, is that that's no longer possible. And the other thing is, if you think about it that direction, the idea that these users and consumers of information are becoming, we're not leaving traces anymore. We are being prompted we are being traced, right? And so every trail we leave generates an incredibly complex network. So the good old-fashioned consumer is now only useful if they're actually a producer of statistics and knowledge and information, right? So it's a completely inverted. This is why no one cares anymore about the customer. It's like, unless they feed the company. But anyway, and I think of this also, I'm going to go back to the students and the systems of networks they use. It also has something to do with their autodidactic ability. And I know we're probably not going to get back to it, but we could have a very practical discussion about some of these things. The lament of the loss, I'm not terribly nostalgic in that sense. Of course, I look at drawings and I think, oh, you know, my students who can both draw and master computational systems, they're the ones you think are the great stars, right? They're the ones you want to award. But it's not so much the drawing I'm worried about losing. It's whatever the act produces, right? So whatever the act of drawing affords in one's thinking. So if we're talking about the trace of the drawing in that sense, I'm more concerned with affordances than the thing itself. I know that's not a direct answer, but it's...
I think your point was partially that it's not, to get to that question of loss, that there wasn't really an originary force behind that drawing too. I mean, you kind of broke down the drawing through the snail into all of its constitutive elements, which are about desire, and they're about balance, and they're about narrative, and so.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to that young woman's question about the best design schools in America. Could I? No.
That's funny.
Ah, interesting. The harsh ones. Yeah, Meredith, that's very interesting. And that's part of the reason why, look, etymology is the road to ruin. But the reason I liked Beauchart's etymology in that particular case, and it's confirmed by the psalmist, is that the exhaustion of the organism itself in inscribing, that was the fear, that it was giving up of itself in a way. And I haven't encountered that so much in other traces I've studied. The trace, the Derridian one, which I have an enormously complex relationship with, but his idea of the furrow, the sillon, which is kind of coextensive with the emergence of writing, what have you. But there, it's always a model of production. The scribe, Isidore Seville, he talks about it in these etymology. But, the scribe, the stylus is opening up the furrow on the page and what have you. But it's all about production and ultimately dissemination. This is about wasting, exhaustion, what have you. So, yeah, that's part of it. And that's why part of the reason that Turner is kind of interesting to me in his retake on the Potade story, where yes, it's about the outline, the trace, which is all about desiring and wanting, and I don't like to cite him, but W.T.J. Mitchell or W.T.J.W. Mitchell, whatever his name is, I don't like him, but in his version of that story, it has to do a drawing out, the act of the drawing out of the desire, the drawing one near you. But for him, it's something else. It's not the limning, it's the substance of the vermilion. And he's very clear about the origin of vermilion. So again, it's something else, a process that has to exhaust itself. The vermilion comes from the female insect in its pupated state. So it's actually not fully in imago yet. It's still in a process of metamorphosis.
Could we use that as a way of potentially characterizing a little bit of this encounter too, maybe, and I'll use this as a way to open up the floor to the audience too. Are we in the process of exhausting ourselves from this encounter between architecture and neuroscience? Or, I sort of began the panel with my colleague Zeynep's sort of fear that we were in the midst of a neurologic turn. Is that really where we are? Are we spending the day analyzing what happens when these two fields come together? I mean, my suspicion is the latter, and that it's worth spending time kind of mining those possible connections and disconnections without falling into the trap of exhaustion that might come from a permanently sustained encounter, or one that starts to take class credit resources away from accreditation, which is such a big issue. So I'm going to open it up to the floor, unless there are other comments about that.
What tiny footnotes I want
Yeah.
to open up.
Yeah.
One of the central terms in Zeynep's review is Benum, you know, the kind of the making of that path or vague or what have you. So that inscription persists in her discourse as well. Yeah.
Questions? I mean, we can also talk about we can wrap up the conference as well as this panel, because this is our last chance to talk to each other. So if anyone has burning questions left over from earlier, please ask them now.
Most of the people are still in the room.
Yeah.
I had a question about the language that's used in this interdisciplinary discourse and the idea that we're talking about architecture and neuroscience, and neuroscientists may be conceiving of architecture as differently from what architects are conceiving, and how you navigate that when you talked about beauty, this study that looked at the beauty between curvilinear and rectilinear spaces, and what kind of meaning that beauty could have for in the instance of that study versus for architects seems to be very different. So if you could talk about that.
Well, I want to put it in more general terms because, again, the conference has been going for 2 days now, and I've only been here one. But I think overall, I mean, for me, it's incredible to have sat here today and listened to all of the, excellent discussions. I was thinking, listening to Philip's talk, just how incredibly inventive and energetic it is to come into to what he's doing with a degree of craftsmanship, and again, sort of marrying concepts outside of art typically, or outside of architecture typically. Life is a very sort of creative process to keep moving along, and I think in general, I mean, first of all, I don't like to use the term, neuroscience in and of itself, because I think, for me, it's sort of these larger sort of biological and interdisciplinary studies that sort of emerge and grow from it. But I mean, my hope is that it really does lead down the road of something like Philip has done, where you basically inform, you come up with new concepts of ways of looking at creation and who we are, and my hope is that it simply continues to sort of enrich this. I think it will, certainly, the next generation that comes along and really sort of takes this sort of research and where and what direction it advances things. So I do want to thank Dan for organizing it, and Ralph, and I know all the work that went into it. Every time I come to a conference, I always look at these people that have been working for weeks and weeks, and then they have to work 15, 16 hours a day. So I know it's very, very hard work to do something like this.
Are there other questions?
So do you guys have an insight on that education system?
I just got back to America. I'm barely learning the one I'm supposed to be running, so I need a little bit of time before I could talk about education systems.
I think things are in flux, and it really isn't going to be decided for another 10 years or so.
I think you might be right.
Educational building do you think is like the best design in terms of
Oh, the actual building, she's changing.
Well, I think that gets to that question that we were trying to put in quotation marks about environmental psychology, and it's been an open question that's been running through the conference all day. Like, can we say that a building is productive of certain sensations and feelings and environments, or do we say that that's produced through other means, or produced differentially amongst all of us? So I suspect that we would all give quite different answers to that question.
My response would be, you have to judge the lunchroom, really.
But just to get back to what you were saying, Professor Mulgrave, about the question of what's outside of architecture and needs to be brought in, I mean, I think both the presentations in this last panel emphasize that, you know, what seems to be outside of the realm of a particular field's knowledge is always exactly through which that field constitutes its own borders, right? Biology constitutes itself through analyses of certain objects, but also by what it doesn't know. So the question of inside and outside is an architectural question, right? It's the very most fundamental architectural question, I would say. It's also, but it's also a question of disciplinarity. And so I hope that it's clear in some ways that the question of disciplinarity is a very, very old one. I think the last two presentations made that especially evident.
Can I add a point to that?
Yeah, please.
One of my favorite thinkers, Gilles Deleuze, he was also someone who worked in many areas, right? I mean, he was a very transdisciplinary thinker in terms of his philosophy, and got into some pretty good fights with people who were from fields he appeared to be appropriating in some way. And one of his comments on it was simply, but I'm not claiming to advance your discipline, right? I'm not claiming to advance neuroscience, right? I'm not claiming to advance a discipline that I'm not an expert in. And to be an expert, one must practice, right? You have to practice. That's why we call it discipline and practice. But I think the discussion is crucial because it allows us to see things and ask questions that we would not see or ask if we are only working in the binder, the blinding moment of the disciplinary insistence. And in academia, historically, if you step outside your discipline, the tribe will punish you. And this is not so true today. It was. I think historians came over the gate last. I mean, historians were scared to death to talk about anything other than things right down their disciplinary line. And they certainly didn't let people in. That was a very protective system in the 90s. It started to break down. But I think the most exciting thing is that we have people like this sitting here who are willing to engage in this discussion. In 2008, when we did the event in Delft, we invited many people who were not architects, and they arrived saying, oh, this is gonna be fun, we don't know why we're here, and they left saying, this was a fantastic discussion, right? So I just think the engagement that you are providing is crucial, and I think everyone here feels that, or they wouldn't have accepted the invitation, right? So thank you, guys, for doing that.
Just maybe for Michael or who's ever left, anybody on the panel, why is neuroscience interested in architecture? Why not, food or I don't know, something else? I mean, what is architecture in a kind of interesting state relative to other things, and why is it an interesting topic for the neuroscientists?
We've got one sitting up there. Michael?
Well, because we're here. In other words, there are 30,000 people who turn up at the annual meeting of the Society for Neuroscience. Very few of them are here. Very few of them would want to be here, but some of us are interested in things like how the body schema relates to the environment, affordances, effectivities, interest in wayfinding, and so on. So I would not say that neuroscience, considered as an entity, is interested in architecture, but rather that there are certain neuroscientists whose expertise raises questions that lead them to find the questions of architecture of interest. And then there are other disciplines where you come to it indirectly. You're concerned with education, you become concerned with schools as places of education, and so you find yourself attracted to the architecture of schools as distinct from architecture as a general concern. We've heard about lifespan architecture, concern for Alzheimer's patients, and so on, and you can see how this could proceed from a concern with the brain and its either its education in one case or its decay in another, and the questions that raises, and then that brings us to the issue of social systems, biopolitics, architectopolitics, environments, funding, and all these ways. So I think that's the answer, that it's not that neuroscience as such is attracted to architecture, but there are questions within neuroscience which lead individuals to become interested in social and medical issues that involve the environments in which those are to be addressed. And for them, the challenge of architecture is exciting.
I remembered that I wanted to ask something at one point in the conference I forgot to ask, because it was with regard to Evan Thompson, who, you know, was a friend of Varela's and wrote something called Mind and Body, I think it was, who he was in Toronto, and he was a professor at University of Toronto, I believe, and was very influential on a number of students. He was a phenomenologist, but he and cognitive scientists, and he was interested in all these issues. But at one point in his account, he says something that I was just thinking about as you were speaking on your final remarks in a way, which was that he said that, you know, I thought his account of how one perceives was very sophisticated in a way and persuasive, but he said that in the, this had to do with Varela's belief that there is, it's possible to access experience directly, and that it's, because Varela also was a Buddhist, but also that you could actually, what was the other thing that he said? It was really interesting. But what Evan Thompson says in relation to the privilege of directly accessing experience was that you had to be very, very careful. You had to have what he called a disciplined account, a careful guidance of the first-person narrative in a certain sense through experience, and that it wasn't just an account of, you know, it wasn't spontaneous account in a sense. It was a studied account that would in some way qualify as a scientific account in spite of being a first-person account. And so it seemed to me very, I mean, I'd been thinking about that for a long time, about like, what did he mean by a disciplined account, and what counts as a disciplined account? If we're talking, I mean, I'm sure there's a whole gradient, right, where I actually see a kind of possibility for disciplined phenomenology in a whole range of directions, but I don't know if it's obvious what that is. I mean, is the account of the patient being, you know, with Alzheimer's, the account of that patient, does that count as a disciplined account, or is it the scientific observation of the patient, you know, that counts, or is it, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's lots of ways in which experience seems as if it belongs to us, and that we can talk about it freely and openly, but in fact and I'm not even arguing for kind of mediation of it in the historical sort of political terms you're talking about. It's just, I'm thinking about that word. What would it mean, disciplined account? And is that true? Do we have to be cautious in that way?
Without being too presumptuous, I'm not a philosopher, but Varela talked about a first-person account combined with a third-person account, and what he meant by that was the first-person account would be a strict Husserlian phenomenological study and description, combined with the third person, which would be empirical testing. That's just my view. Let me just add, there's a wonderful critique of Thompson that's in the second edition of Maxime Johnstone's book on the primacy of movement. And I thought, again, that was a sort of interesting concept that came to my mind today in some of the discussions of some of the speakers. Kinesthesia, animism, etc.
Any last questions? Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and we hope to continue the conversation upstairs over drinks.
Again, I'd just like to thank all the presenters, all of you that have come, the Pratt Institute, ANFA, everyone that's been involved. Thank you so much.